Hey everybody, it's about that time yet again. Reminder that Friday we're going to meet in the library. I think it's classroom. Well, I'll post it to our class website. I shouldn't just take a random guess at what the classroom number is, but it's on the third floor of the library. People hopefully know where the library is. There will be basically going over some basics about research, but the hope is that will give you kind of a start on your midterm paper, which, reminder, we pushed back the due date for that to November 1st, just because we got a bit behind. Want to give people more than enough time to kind of do it. Yes?
Are you going to be recording that class too on Friday in the library?
Actually, I hadn't thought about it. I could ask the librarian is going to be doing it, and so I could ask them, and my guess is that they wouldn't have any objections. So I'll try.
Okay, awesome.
And we will actually be doing a little bit of stuff also in our little lab over here, doing research, and hopefully that'll be my chance to kind of show you some AI stuff. So at least you are kind of get a start on understanding the current technological revolution that's happening right now. Any other questions? Well, all right. Well, today we'll definitely be able to finish up this chapter on religion and culture. Religion and culture, the final part of this whole unit. Map from our book looking at percentage of religious adherence. Probably nothing that you would be super surprised about, other than the fact that maps like this that show the real broad, big picture, they're useful, but there's a lot of things that you don't see, right? So for example, if you're looking at Africa, right, it looks like it's just kind of like half one religion and half the other. But a more detailed map would actually have, well, there's three main religious belief systems in Africa, but the maps make it seem like there's only two. I would say in general, Christianity kind of came from this way, diffused this way, and then Islam diffused this way. And then actually in this section you have a mixture of the two, but you also have a lot of the animist religions. Animist religions still exist through large parts of Africa, and actually most of the rest of the world. Most of the indigenous belief systems, most of the older belief systems before most of these kind of larger universalizing religions, animist systems are when, they're pretty place specific, right? So if you have a very specific religious connection to a specific river, a forest, or even one specific tree, right? Things on the landscape, animals, things like that. And so if you've ever kind of studied older religions, that's the kind of stuff, right? But a lot of that stuff, because it's so specific, it doesn't translate to the whole world, right? You're not going to get someone on the other side of the planet to have a belief system worshiping your stream and your tree and your rock and your this and that, right? Let's see if there's anything else of note here. I would also point out, well, as you can tell, there's religious adherents for different religions that are very often far away from where they originated, right? Their origination point. When it comes to the signs of the different belief systems, you can see, well, right now as it stands, Christianity is a bit more, but the rapidly rising categories, well, for example, Hinduism, well, that's been rising rapidly, but mostly because of birth rates, not because it's been diffusing. It's not really being taken up by people who aren't on continental India, other than people who are moving from there elsewhere. Whereas Christianity and Islam are more universalizing religions that are, they seek converts, right, around the world. The most rapidly going category of these is actually the unaffiliated, which you can see if that was counted as a religion. It's difficult to count it that way, but the unaffiliated are growing rapidly. And we talked a little bit about this locally in the U.S., but this is a worldwide phenomenon. Most studies have correlated the rise of the unaffiliated with basically how much internet access people have. Through time and through different countries, the more internet access they have, the more they're switching to unaffiliated. Religions in the U.S. Again, this might be similar to what you would think, but this is why when they talk about very often like politics and stuff in this region of the world, right, Mormonism becomes much more important compared to just about anywhere else in the U.S. I would say, let's see, probably hear a lot of Lutheran jokes if you live in Minnesota because, we have a lot more geographically. Most of these mixtures depended on basically the settlement pattern. I don't know, people know much of the history about Mormons and Mormonism, like the wars that happened and stuff? Or why is Mormonism located mostly over here? Do people know? Do they like mountains? Well, similar to many other religions, it was not founded there. It was founded, I believe, like Pennsylvania over here. And what happened was, if you know anything about Mormonism, it tends to have a history of, having multiple wives, right? That's kind of the thing that people talk about. Now, modern day Mormons have mostly kind of turned away from that, but there's still plenty of Mormons that still practice that. In the founding of Mormonism in the U.S., a lot of people were upset about this practice, and there was a number of kind of bands and whatnot that had decided that this group was basically indoctrinating people's wives and taking their wives away from them to join this new religion that at the time people did not consider to be an actual religion. To the point that even there were local laws as the Mormons would kind of flee these different persecutions. There would be different laws in different places against specifically Mormons and the practice of having multiple wives. Well, so they went to Mexico. And I know you're saying to yourself, well, that's not Mexico. Well, it was. That was Mexico for a long time. And there's actually plenty of people of that heritage who stayed there when it became the U.S. But at the time, the Mormons located here, this was outside of the U.S. laws and territory. And then when this area became a part of the U.S., they had basically kind of structured into that society. So there wasn't a reason to then flee to further to where modern day Mexico is. Well, in general, when it comes to religions, there's universalizing religions, right? These are religions that tend to want everyone to join, right? Christianity being kind of one of the better known ones. Let's see here on our map. Although Christianity is very associated with Europe, partially because it was once Christianity got into Europe that it really kind of diffused around the rest of the world through colonization, right? The same time that Europeans were taking over, they were also bringing their religion. But as we always point out, obviously did not start in Europe. There's something kind of interesting that happened about 1,000 years ago. And now you're thinking, nothing interesting happened 1,000 years ago. But there was something that the major religions of the world, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, they decided basically, these empires, ancient empires and modern empires, they both basically are fueled by slavery, right? By enslaving populations. Well, for a long period of time, you could legally enslave anyone who was outside of your kingdom, right? And so this geared up a lot of local wars. If you get raided by local kingdoms and they've been taking people, maybe took some of your family, they enslaved them, did who knows what to them, right? That creates a lot of animosity through time, as you can imagine. 1,000 years ago, the major religions said, actually, we're no longer going to enslave people that are part of our own religion, only other religions. And what did that do 1,000 years ago? That made it so wars, they used to be about monarchies and kind of different little nation states. It made them religious wars. And so it made it all of a sudden that they would recruit people from far away who'd be of the same religion for big wars. So the wars themselves really kind of increased through time. In Guns, Germs, and Steel, we saw how this kind of evolved in modern day war. But that's a big part of why that went down. Religions in Europe, well, actually, looking at this map, give you an idea of what a big kind of influence slavery was through time, right? The Slavic people, right? The Slavs, which is basically Eastern Europe and into Russia. Well, the reason that term sounds like Slav, slave, is because these populations enslaved each other for a long period of time, for a very long period of time. There were a population in Ukraine that were the Tartars, and they would enslave people from Russia, and vice versa. And this was like 1 million people through years, just kind of constantly having these fights. When, there was so much bitterness that at the end of the Second World War, one of the things that Russia did was they decided that some populations in Ukraine were enemies, the Tartars, for example, and they just death marched them over to Kazakhstan, right? And so that population still lives over here when they're from here, right? But these old animosities, even though obviously this was long in history, the Russian people still very much wanted to kind of make that group pay the price. Islam, another universalizing religion, similar to Christianity, was mostly spread through empires and empire building. There's an amount of how these religions spread in other ways. So for example, if you're ever looking on the news and you're maybe surprised that there's a real good-sized Islamic population in Asia, but there weren't actually big colonies or empires. Those were just through trade, through international trade networks, the spice trade specifically, right? One's on the continent. Why does this look like it's shaking? Our camera's shaking. The ones on continent were much more likely to be spread through empire building, right? You can see a core area, right, and spreading throughout. And you also notice we have green lines coming up here, right? And then you have these red lines coming down here. Basically, this whole area went back and forth between Christianity and Islam over hundreds of years, kind of back and forth. Buddhism, another universalizing religion, and another religion that is mostly not in its origin site, right? In modern day India, there are some Buddhists, but the vast majority are outside of that area. When I went to Egypt, I went to a couple different religiously significant places. I don't know if I ever told this story about when I went to the Muhammad Ali Mosque and like people were going with their swimsuits on. Did I mention that story at all? Well, when I travel, I always try to look up local customs and whatnot, because you don't want to like stick your foot in your mouth or do something dumb that another culture wouldn't like. So, for example, when I went to the Vatican, they have a bit of a dress code that is not really enforced, but in general, you should have long sleeves, like they want your skin covered up, right? If you're a woman, they want you to have a scarf around your head, right? And these all sound very old-fashioned, but like that's kind of, when you go to the Vatican, that's in general kind of the rules at play. When I went to Egypt, and I was planning on going to some kind of famous mosques, and in the Muhammad Ali Mosque, the fighter was named after the historical character rather than the reverse. If you heard the term Muhammad Ali before and you're like, isn't that a boxer? Well, he was Cassius Clay before that. Changed his name quite a bit. Final one was Muhammad Ali. But that's when he converted to Islam. Well, anyway, back to the story. When I was going here, I'd read similarly that, you shouldn't have a lot of skin exposed. And then women should put something over their hair and all this type of stuff. And when I went, and I was told this is kind of one of the more sacred prayer spots in Egypt, there were a bunch of tourists there, and they were just like, they had just come from the beach. They were wearing swimsuits, which I thought would be really kind of inflammatory. I thought maybe people would get really upset. But Egypt isn't like that. Egypt, I found out, is kind of, I asked my guide about it and whatnot, and he said that since tourists have been coming to Egypt for literally thousands of years, there's more of a live and let live attitude. They're not fundamentalists, right? And I think that is a thing that's confusing for a lot of people. They'll think kind of wherever you go, a different religion, people are fundamentalist, and they'll be very kind of stringent, right? When that's usually not the case. Most places around the world where you go, the religious beliefs are not like enforced, at the end of a gun or anything like that. In fact, when I went, like I said, I expected like maybe people would be upset, but I would say everyone is actually extremely sedate, like extremely relaxed. I asked my guide about that, and he said that they believe that Islam is peace, right? If you've heard that phrase, and you may say, what do you mean there's wars and stuff? Well, how he explained it to me was that when they would pray, since they consider God to be peace, rather than praying and kind of wishing for things and stuff like that, when they pray, they are just kind of clearing their mind, right? And so you're taking that time, and the norm is to pray 5 times a day, and each time you're trying to like empty out all of the thoughts of your day and just think about nothing, basically. And therefore you'd be pretty sedate too, if you're pretty relaxed if you're doing that. The domes are made out of alabaster, which is a rock that you can mostly only find in Egypt. It's basically if you took marble and pressed it for an extra million years, like under the Earth's surface. The other kind of interesting thing about Egypt is there's evidence all around of older religions, right? Because the ancient Egyptian Empire had they were polytheistic, right? And there are polytheistic religions today. Hinduism. Anyone know how many gods there are in Hinduism? There's about as many gods as there are people in the U.S. They have over 300 million gods. It's a lot, right? That's because basically a lot of place-specific ones all merged, right? So where I was using the example of indigenous religions where you'll have a stream or a river or a tree, different local things, well, they all just kind of merged in Hinduism, right? And Hinduism itself feels like a lot of different religions together. Oh, actually, and when I went to Egypt, you could see that the faces of these are chiseled out. Anyone hazard to guess who would chisel out the faces of these ancient scribings here? Well, it was actually Christians. Christians did this because the whole region was for hundreds of years Christian. But these were considered pagan gods. And very often when religions do diffuse, very often they make efforts to destroy evidence of other religions' existence on the landscape, right? It's somewhat ironic that they chisel out the faces because the faces are actually supposed to be identical. They felt that God would have one perfect face, so God wouldn't have different faces. But you could tell which God is which from their hats, which they did not deface. And so, but at least I made a home for a bird. I was in Egypt one day, and a family walked by as we were having dinner. We were having a stuffed pigeon, which I don't know if people have ever had that. It's kind of a normal meal in Egypt, stuffed pigeon. Mostly you're eating the stuffing that is rice and beans and stuff. Pigeon itself is okay, but like not great. Well, this family walked by, and my guide said, "Oh, they're Christians, you should say hi." And I was like, well, okay. I couldn't tell how he could tell, but locals can tell from how each other look. I found out later that basically the Christians in Egypt, they're the ethnicity that was there before the Islamic and Arab peoples came through, right? So the populations today that exist in much of the world, including this area of the world, were not there before. And so it's about 13% of the population. Part of the identifying things are things that we call cultural flags. In geography is the term, a cultural flag. So for example, something that you would wear that kind of says who you are culturally. So you can see she has kind of two things hanging there, right? Obviously the cross, don't need to explain that one too much. But then this is specifically an Egyptian symbol. So she's wearing something that very specifically is saying, I'm Christian, but I'm also of Egypt, right? And it's interesting because, well, the population that are Christian today, that are a minority of the population, and they actually suffer quite a bit of persecution and whatnot. You might read on the news every now and then. When I was there, it was Christmas, because that's when I get time off, and there were bombings of churches and stuff. So there's violence that happens. But this population is actually genetically related to the ancient Egyptians, whereas the other populations all came in much later, you know? Just like the US has mostly people who came in later, right? Much of the world. It's your little sister. Like I said, when I was there, it was Christmas, and although Christians are a small percentage of the population, they're a big percentage of the tourists. So there's a lot of stuff that was put up that was kind of Christmassy, right? It's like, well, obviously there was not going to be any snow there. These were in all the airports for some reason. I don't know why they had a saxophone playing Santa Claus, but it was animatronic. When you would walk by it as a motion detector and they would start dancing and playing the saxophone, which, you know, is like, I guess not super Christmassy, but so I mentioned there was bombing when I was there, right? And so they're very high security, as you can imagine. And so we would have our bags scanned very often if we'd be going places. And one time, was going to a place, and I had the security guard come up to me, and he said, hey, what are you trying to pull here? What are you doing? And I looked at it, and I was kind of like, is my camera on top of my cell phone, and together they look like a weird gun? And then he pressed a button and it vanished. And he said, ha 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 ha, gotcha. Yeah, and I was like, you did get me, yes. If I hadn't been so analytical trying to figure out what happened, I might have been like, crapping myself. But then I said, put that back up, I want to take a picture for my students. And so that's why this actually says it's a fictional, they could just put that on anyone's bag. Press a button, there's a gun. Great. In this chapter, it talks about a number of different religions that are kind of well known, but also not, like Sikhs. We actually have a fair amount of local Sikh population, and people will see this kind of look, right, with a turban and stuff, and they often will connect in their minds kind of fundamentalist Islamic religion, but this is not Islamic. In fact, most of this population are pretty strict pacifists, but they will suffer a lot of persecution because they do have a specific dress code And people will see this look, and they'll, if they have some amount of bigotry already, this will kind of set them off. When it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It's like these populations are definitely not Islamic, right? Mostly from India. Now India, the majority is Hindu, Hinduism. There's a fair amount of Islamic populations that are still within India. This whole area used to be more mixed. When this was during colonialism, this whole area surrounding was under the British rule, and during the decolonization phase, basically after the Second World War, I know I've talked about this before, after the Second World War, most countries in Europe could not sustain their empires because their armies were all blown up. And then on top of that, they also had a psychological awakening that maybe colonization wasn't a great moral choice, right? Well, before they left this region, there was a very bad map maker who basically said, I'm gonna draw this line, and this area I will say is just Hindu, and then I'm gonna make a country that's East and West Pakistan that are gonna be the opposite sides, but they'll be one country, they'll make it work, because they're all Islamic, and so they'll just be one country. When that happened and the British left, there was a mad rush by Hindu populations to get in this area and Islamic populations to get out, because everyone was suddenly very afraid that there would be ethnic and religious clashes, and you wouldn't have the British there basically to kind of stop that from happening. And so there was this mad rush, and actually many were killed. Many thousands of people were killed, because as people were kind of fleeing the different areas and trying to get to the other areas, you go through other communities, and what would happen is people didn't know what was going on. All of a sudden you have 1,000 people coming into your community, right? And so people treated it like invasions, and so there was big conflicts and fights and stuff. It was a very, very chaotic time. I forget, anyone in this class been to India? Been to India? Alright. I did show you the video about the caste system last time, right? Got a nod? Okay. Well, when I went to India, I really only was on the kind of western side of India. I didn't go to a lot of the kind of big high-tech cities and stuff. I was mostly going for kind of where the ancient kingdoms and whatnot were. Taj Mahal, one of the more kind of famous structures in India, but its architecture is very, very Islamic in nature, because that was part of one of the many Islamic empires that used to rule this whole region through time. As you can see, quite crowded. I would say one of the things that Guns, Germs, and Steel did not cover that I really wish they would have, they very briefly said that guns diffused from this region before Europeans then used them for colonization efforts. But part of that, well, these regions also used guns to take over very large areas, very large empires. And in fact, these empires are referred to as gunpowder empires. These ones specifically in this region of the world. As you can see, well, the Ottoman Empire expanded quite a bit into Europe. Today, I would say the modern border of Islam in Europe would be kind of Turkey, right? This area is really mixed, but there are still wars. The war in the 90s in Serbia and Kosovo, that was mostly a religious war, right? Because there's still Islamic populations, and the Serbian population basically decided to eliminate the Islamic population from the map, including trying to destroy libraries that had documents about Islam existing there. Like I said, this often happens in religious conflicts where they'll specifically try to erase the existence of the other group from that area. Islam, like many of the religions that we're looking at, originated in a very small area, right, in Arabia, and diffused through large areas. The diffusion happened very rapidly, especially when guns were invented and used. And again, gunpowder came from East Asia, but this is the region that put the things together. Taj Mahal, you can actually see the Islamic aspects a little bit more. In general, Islamic architecture, if you want to kind of tell, well, you can see these four structures, right? You can kind of see these in a lot of this type of architecture, but also, well, maybe you can't see it, but there's script here, like writing, right? And that's also very common. And then basically geometric patterns, right? And not representations of people, right? That's not an aspect. That is like, you'd see that in a lot of like Christian churches and whatnot, a lot of depictions of actual people and stuff, but that is a no-no in Islam. Geometry is more what they're focused on. I talked about this a bit. This is actually just the other side that no one ever takes a picture of. The Taj Mahal is that side, and you look at this side and you have this structure. But this structure, you could see the script writing much better, right? I'm a bit closer in. You could also see how the geometry was kind of the focus. These are some pilgrims. This is actually jumping over to India. Anyone been to India? India is a place where we got a lot of culture shock. I would say that a common thing of travel is having culture shock. Much of the world, convergence theory, most of the world is actually becoming more similar to each other. And so actually through time, I've experienced a lot less culture shock in going to places because places are just starting, the cities especially, are just starting to look the same. Varanasi that I went to, which is kind of like one of the more sacred holy cities with a number of different religions. But this was an area along the Ganges, right? You've probably heard of the Ganges. This is part of the things about Hinduism that are much more similar to older religions, right? That were based on physical features of landscape. You might see in this photo a little swastika. This isn't that there's Nazis here. The Nazis stole the symbol from India. India used that symbol, and then the opposite, I forget what that's called, but India has all kinds of symbols, and the Nazis just took theirs and declared it their Nazi symbol. I'll take you kind of down a little, not a cruise as much as just a little journey down the Ganges a bit. So Varanasi is basically the place where if you have a dead relative or someone you care about, and you want them to have a good chance in the afterlife, you would bring their body here, and then you may have a funeral fire where, it's burned to ashes. And so, this is one big city where everyone is kind of doing that, right? And you can imagine it being a bit chaotic and whatnot. Like I said, considered a very religious area. I was there during the kind of top of the dry season, so the water level is actually much lower than it normally is. You could kind of see how high and low the water level would be allowed to go. There's lots of temples that are on the bottom of the river, right? You can see this one's kind of on its way. A lot of infrastructure has been put in to kind of stop that from happening, but the real older ancient ones, they're still kind of like too late. You might notice in a lot of these pictures like a lot of garbage. When you travel, you'll notice in plenty of places people will have an opposite idea of something than you do. And what I mean by that is the Ganges is considered sacred and pure and clean, and therefore bathing in it is something that everyone does. It's a ritual, and it's considered like the ultimate cleansing, right? But the Ganges, rivers in developing countries are like rivers in the more developed countries in the past, meaning industry just pumps stuff into them. They're full of refuse and pollution and garbage, right? But, right, that it's like, but it's not. It's pure and clean, but you could see the garbage and stuff, but people don't think of it that way, right? I would say in general, all along the river you have lots of people who are camping out, people who are pilgrims who've come in. There are religious people who just live here year round as well. Like I said, you see everyone bathing. I am surprised that they kind of haven't increased their environmental regulations to make it the cleanest source of water possible, you know, because since all this is done, because everyone is drinking it too and whatnot, and it's like, I wouldn't drink out of the Mississippi, and there's rules about what you can dump in the Mississippi. It's like, would I drink out of this? It's like, they don't have a lot of environmental regulations because those are expensive, right? A lot of this is usually people who are pilgrims who are coming in. Well, like I said, when it comes to culture shock, so a lot of people, they're bringing a deceased loved one here because they want to go through this ritual. But very often, India is a developing country and there's a lot of poverty. And this region itself is a poorer area within this country. And a lot of people who do this, who bring the bodies of the deceased loved ones, they will get here and then they won't have any money for the fire and stuff. And so what is done often is they'll kind of scrap together a couple logs and maybe some refuse, and then they will make a fire and they'll kind of do the best they can. But the thing I'm not taking pictures of in these, because I was told it was rude, all along this river there are fires all over, and there are dead bodies. There are dead bodies all over, kind of partially burned, just kind of all over. Like I said, this is culture shock, right? It's like, there it's very much accepted, right? It's like, yep, there's dead bodies here and there. You coming into the train station, there's plenty of people who brought the body that far and then they just couldn't bring it more, right? So you'll be in a train station, there'll just be like bodies just waiting for people to kind of scoop them up. Babies who die don't need to go through the fire process, but what they'll do is they'll just put them directly in the river. So you will have a baby body float by you if you're in a boat on the river, right? Culture shock. Oh, this looks a little smoky because what this is, the government has put in a couple public incinerators because of this body problem, right? Because it's not very sanitary to have a lot of rotting bodies. And so they do have people that go out and collect them. If you visit, it might be a bit jarring to see, because people will be going with pliers to get fillings out of teeth and stuff, all right? It's like, but these are people who are desperately poor. But this is the one area of burning that I took a picture of. I should say in the video I showed, the Brahmin priest had some ashes on his head, and he talked about those being purified. There are religious men who I do not have a picture of, but the ash is purified because it's human remains that have been burned, right? And so again, when the culture has this emphasis on cleanliness and being clean, but at the same time, things that are considered pure, other cultures would consider not being clean. If you ever see pictures of this area or a documentary or whatever, and if you see a guy has a great big beard and he's covered in ash, head to toe, usually naked, those are the religious men who are walking around. And again, those ashes are considered pure, but they are from the corpses that have been burned. They're kind of all over. one of the pictures I took as it was getting a little dark. A lot of fire ceremonies connected with that tradition of burning the loved ones. We've talked a lot about universalizing religions. There's plenty of religions that are more ethnic religions. I would say Hinduism is one of those. It's not specifically an ethnic religion, but it's not really diffusing into other cultures very much, right? Judaism is another religion that is pretty place-specific, right? It's place and time-specific, right? And a number of the religions that are not universalizing, that's kind of what they're like. They're like, okay, today in class, we're going to decide this area here are the sacred God's chosen people, right? And it doesn't matter who's sitting here tomorrow, right? And you can't sit on their laps. It's too late. This is the sacred people, right? That's basically a non-universalizing religion. Because it's like, well, how are you going to join that religion? Well, they made some allowances for intermarriage, right? So people can convert, but it's not a religion that is trying to get more members. Now, we also talked about secularism a bit, and the rising of atheism and whatnot. Geography in general kind of usually ties the rise of this to Europe, Western Europe after the Second World War. And it's usually because it coincides with the making of modern nations without a religious doctrine to it, right? And this isn't true all over. Like Britain, they technically have a state religion. They're not pushy about it. I don't know. People know much about the Anglican Church in Britain? Well, in a nutshell, Henry VIII wanted to have more wives, right? And the religion specifically, right, was Christianity, was like, no, that's not part of the rules. Well, he declared, we're going to make our own branch of this religion because I've decided I want to have more wives. No one else needs to have more wives, but I'm going to have more wives. And that's going to make it so divorce is possible. And that is why Britain has a different religion, because you had one person who kind of made it so. Church attendance in countries, you could see that religious observance in Europe is quite a bit less, kind of depending on where you go. And then I showed you some of this information before about religion in the U.S. on the decline by quite a bit. Very generationally. The older generations are still very religious. It's not like they're getting less religious. It's just the newer generations. And again, this is usually correlated with how much access to the internet people have. That's usually the main thing. All right, gonna have y'all, as always, do some small group questions. I'll come out and do the card thing. Did I shuffle these? Kinda. All right.